What really happened with your host, Mike Rivero. You're listening to the Republic Broadcasting Network, where you'll find out what the Fukushima's going on.
And aloha, America. Welcome to our show today. It is Thursday, March 1st, 2018, start of a brand new month. And, of course, March is named for the god of war, Mar. And historically, wars have started in the month of March. There are actually very few exceptions to that. It was a Roman tradition. Wars would start in the month of March, the Ides of March, so forth and so on. And it does look like we're gearing up for a major war sometime in the next 30 days. Everybody's all suited up. They've got the uniforms on. They've got all the kit. They're just waiting for the starting flag. All right, we got a lot of stuff to talk about today. The phone lines are open, 800-313-9443, and Mike is in our control room, twiddling the dials, keeping us out of trouble, and ready to answer the phone when you call on in. Now, yesterday I started out the show with a quote, and I got some positive response to that. I'm going to do it again today, not because this is going to become a new feature of the show, but for those of you who visit my website, you know that I have this automated quote system. I have a master file of all these quotes, and every night during the chores run on the server, it will choose a new thought for the day. And sometimes it is almost eerie how appropriate these quotes can be. Today is a good example, and that's why I want to read this one for you. And it goes, I know the American people are much attached to their government. I know they would suffer much for its sake. I know they would endure evils long and patiently before they would ever think of exchanging it for another. Yet notwithstanding all this, if the laws be continually despised and disregarded, if their rights to be secure in their persons and property are held by no better tenure than the caprice of a mob, the alienation of their affections from the government is the natural consequence, and to that, sooner or later, it must come. And that is Abraham Lincoln. And it does seem like he absolutely was correct. The government has abused our rights, and Americans are not in love with their government anymore, nor should they be. All right, let's get back into Parkland and how everybody is still trying to exploit this tragedy for their own ends, and the gun grabbers are out there just desperate to try and get a groundswell of support for a gun ban, and they're just being stupid out there. Story that came out of immediatesafety.org, and they're talking about a new trend is sweeping the nation. It's called red lighting. Activists are changing the normal white porch light bulbs with special red bulbs, letting the world know this is a gun-free home. Okay, so you got that, criminals? You rapists, you muggers, you burglars, you thieves, you listening? Go to the home with the red light on. They don't have guns. You can do whatever you want. Or, alternatively, it's a whorehouse. But either way, you're going to have a good time. I mean, talk about a ridiculous idea, advertising that your home lacks any defenses. Obviously, this was not thought all the way through. When I was growing up, all the porch lights were yellow anyway, bug lights. Now, apparently, CNN put their foot on it again. They're out there with an AR-15 trying to convince Americans it's a dangerous weapon, so it serves no purpose that any law-abiding citizen would want. And they started claiming that they were going to show this gun on full semi-automatic mode. And, of course, gun experts immediately said, this is ridiculous. There is no such thing as a full semi-automatic when describing an AR-15. He just wanted to get that word full in there to sell that whole idea. Remember, not too long ago, CNN's Gary Tuchman intentionally embellished the recoil of an AR-15 to make the rifle appear uncontrollable and dangerous. He was out there saying, see, you can't really do anything with it. It's just there for killing people. Actually, I've target shot with an AR-15. Long time ago. Same time I was into my black powder. I used to go shooting with this ex-Marine, and he had a heck of a gun collection. And we'd put up the paper, and we'd spend all day punching holes in it, which is enjoyable. It's fun. By the way, I actually got an email from somebody who is into archery, bow and arrow, and I'm sympathetic to that because I was on my college archery team. And apparently there are now restrictions on obtaining bows and arrows. Next it'll be knives. Next it'll be Nerf guns. Anyway, a little bit more about that incident that happened yesterday about this supposedly mentally unstable teacher who barricaded himself in a classroom and fired a shot through the window. And it's just too much of a coincidence to believe in. Just as Trump suggests arming teachers, the gun grabbers get a lucky break and have a teacher go postal. I don't buy it, and as it turns out, we shouldn't, because apparently this guy is a registered Democrat, and he basically donates to gun control causes. We don't even know if that was really his gun or somebody just gave him the gun and said, we need a teacher to go on out and end this arming the teacher nonsense. But it is too much of a coincidence. We're going to do a shout out now to our on-air affiliates who are just now rejoining our network. But basically, what we have here, let's see, there it is. Okay. Earlier today, there was a bomb threat reported at a high school in Montgomery County, Albert Einstein High School. And apparently one of the parents of the children there is a reader of the site, because I got the emails, the emergency emails forwarded to me, and it got on there. And they basically did the school on lockdown. Somebody called in, said there was an explosive on the premises. They did a search. Nothing was found. The kids have now been allowed to go home. But again, just like this teacher who fired a gun in a classroom, this bomb threat attacks another alternative suggestion to ban all the guns, and that is the suggestion to make schools safer. See, you can't make the schools safe. You're just going to... That's what the gun grabbers are trying to push. A gun ban is the only workable solution, which ignores the history showing gun bans have never worked. This is all just too cute. It's all way too cute. I'm not buying any of this stuff. Okay, now, here's the reality. Gun grabbers like to go on out and say, look, you don't need a gun. You got the police. The police will protect you. Well, Florida shows that they don't. You had these 4 sheriff's deputies. One was outside the school from the very start. The other showed up while the shooting was going on. What did they do? Nothing. They all stayed outside the school, and all those kids got shot. Not a single one of these cops, a single one of these deputy sheriffs, armed with deadly weapons and trained, supposedly, for such a scenario, entered the school to confront the shooter. Now, you let that think in for a moment. And then you think in about all these other mass shootings where the police didn't go on in until it was all over. Now, either that's an argument to say that, yes, these were staged false flag incidents and they wanted to maximize the body count for shock value. But the reality is, in the good old days of radio scanners, and I had one, police radio was still unencrypted. And I used to sit there at night and I would listen to the police there in North Hollywood respond to the scene of a crime where the criminal was on the premises, and you would just hear them sit and say, do you think the guy's left yet? Contrary to what you see on movies and TVs, the cops do not crash through the door and apprehend the criminal in the process of committing the crime. They show up after it's all over. The only ones there when the crime is being committed is the perpetrator and the victim. And the only way to thwart the crime is that the victim have arms equal, if not superior, to those of the perpetrator. That is the only workable solution. Now, little clarification. One of the other stories that emerged earlier this week was how the police would not allow the medics into the school. And the medics are furious because the normal procedure in a mass casualty event is you accept the risk, something is going on, you go on in and you get to those patients who are most badly wounded, you stop the bleeding, you stop them from bleeding out. And the medics have gone public saying they weren't allowed in, and that probably many of those 17 who died did not need to. Well, there's been a clarification. It wasn't the police who didn't let the medics into the school. It was the Broward County deputy sheriffs. Now, one of the survivors of the shooting, Kyle Kashuv, told Fox News that he believes Broward County Sheriff Scott Israel absolutely needs to resign amid reports the deputy assigned to the school failed to act during the event. I don't know why he still has a job. He should have been fired. Now, David Hogg is still, despite being discredited and revealed as a crisis actor, he's still getting a lot of airtime on CNN. He's the darling of CNN, and there was an interview came on out about how angry he is that despite his best efforts that gun sales are increasing. Well, come on, Dave. Every time the gun grabbers go on a rampage, gun sales go through the roof. It happens every single time. And anybody who understands what's going on knows why this is so. Now, the reality is Nicholas Cruz, ideal patsy. This guy was just telegraphing, I'm psychotic, I'm a school shooter. He couldn't have been more obvious if he'd taken out full-page ads in the local newspapers. And who knows, maybe this was all engineered for him. Remember all the phony Oswalds that showed up before the assassination of John F. Kennedy? We don't know how much of these Facebook posts or tweets or Twitters are really originated with Nicholas Cruz. Now, here's an interesting development. Somebody tried to write on in and say that this Parkland High School appeared to be a military school. No, it isn't. It's an ordinary high school. But like many ordinary high schools across the country, it has a junior ROTC chapter, the Reserve Officer Training Corps. It's a sort of a high school version of the same program they have in college. And they teach these kids leadership, cooperation, and they teach them how to shoot. Now, 3 of the cadets in the school's junior ROTC were killed by the shooting. It turns out Nicholas Cruz had also been a member of the junior ROTC cadet. Apparently, that's where he was taught to shoot. They used little air guns, air pellet guns. And it's interesting because I recall back in the 1970s when there was a series of unexplained shootings and they blamed Marine training. That was the reason. The Marines just taught these kids to kill. Now, I want to do a little flashback here as we continue to see all this stuff coming on out about grabbing the guns, about bad Russia, about bad North Korea, about bad China, and all the rest of it. I want to remind everybody, when it comes to fake news, most of it's coming, all of it's coming from the government. And back in 2013, the U.S. government repealed the legal ban on propagandizing U.S. citizens and just unleashed a tsunami of government-made news to Americans. There are military intelligence people who work right in the CNN newsroom. That's how tightly connected they are. Now, Trump has basically shot down Steve Scalise's concealed carry reciprocity bill. And Trump says he likes the bill, but he says it's not going to pass in the current environment, and I fear that he's probably right about that. But Scalise was out there talking about surviving a shooting, because obviously he did. And he said, in his case, the law enforcement reacted instantaneously. That if they'd waited for 17 minutes the way the deputies down in Florida did, he wouldn't be with us. Now, Trump has come on out with an idea saying that when dealing with the mentally ill, Trump says government should take the guns first and then go through the due process second. Now, it sounds like a kind of common sense solution that if you suspect somebody is mentally ill, you should disarm them and then go back and double check to make sure you did the right thing and you're still safe if the person really is mentally ill. The only problem I have with that, of course, is the abuse of the term mentally ill. Right now in our present psychiatric industry, if you will, wanting to eat safe, healthy, natural food is considered a mental illness. And I don't want to have guns taken away from people just because they avoid the Big Mac sandwiches. So we need a clear definition of what represents a person who is danger to themselves or to others. And I would put on that list anybody who is on these dangerous prescription psychiatric medications. And for their own safety, yeah, I think it's a good idea to disarm them. I mean, the family that this Nicholas Cruz was living with did take his guns away and lock them up. Unfortunately, he had a key to the gun cabinet. But while it sounds like it's a good idea, and it sounds wise and prudent, the potential for the abuse of who is mentally ill is very real. I mean, we've had people already saying that anybody who doesn't believe the government's story about anything obviously is mentally ill. It's an old holdover from the Soviet Union. And so they could be laying the groundwork for anybody who doesn't 100% agree with the government gets disarmed. So it's not as good an idea as you might want to think at first. And a lot of people are wondering if Trump is really as pro-gun as he claimed to be during the campaign, because he's caving in on a lot of the issues the gun grabbers want. All right, getting on over into domestic political corruption. As you know, Nunes' memo exposed this huge scandal of how the FBI and Department of Justice obtained a visa warrant against Page. And the FBI used the fake news Fusion GPS Russian dossier as their evidence to obtain the warrant. Now, Democrats have come out with their own memo, led by Adam Schiff, trying to knock that down, claiming that the dossier was corroborated by multiple sources. But when former FBI Director James Comey briefed President-elect Trump about the dossier last January, he described it as salacious and unverified. And that means the FBI knew it was a hoax when they took it to the FISA court. Now, a lot of people are trying to take the heat off this investigation, not just to save the FBI and Department of Justice. They don't want Americans taking a close look at that FISA court and how it is used to bypass our Fourth Amendment protections, to our right to privacy. Now, as you know, Hope is gone from the White House, and by that I mean Hope Hicks, the former director of communications. And apparently, when she was testifying before a congressional committee, she admitted to telling small white lies, fibs, on the behalf of Donald Trump, and Donald Trump got very angry with that, and I can understand why. Because everybody's trying to maintain credibility. Trump is doing it better than Adam Schiff and the Democrats, but still in all, the Democrats and the media seize on every little thing to attack him. And Hope Hicks handed the media a bit of ammunition that they could use against him. Oh, what else did she lie about? And so that was why she resigned, or was forced to resign. I keep hearing stories about the conditions inside the White House right now are so tense. There's so much politics going on. Everybody's vying for promotions or trying to get their competition or their opponents, their ideological opponents out. Must be a terrible, terrible place to work. Now, as you know, the media has been obsessing over the fact that Jared Kushner's security clearance has been ratcheted down one notch, and he's no longer allowed to see top secret information. But Hillary Clinton still has her top secret clearance, even though she no longer works for the government at all, and after the FBI email probe, it admitted that she was being reckless with government secrets. Why does she still have a top secret clearance? She shouldn't have. That's not the rules. I went through the process myself way back when I worked for NASA. You get the clearance when you're on a project where it's required, and when you finish that job, the clearance goes away. You return all your materials. That's how it normally works. You don't get a top secret clearance as a lifetime achievement award. All right, we'll be right back after these words from our sponsors. Aloha, America. Welcome back to our show. And if you would like to help keep Republic Broadcasting Network on the air, and we really do need it, we're not kidding about this. The postal address to send a check or money order is Republic Broadcasting Network, 2251 Double Creek Drive, number 302, Round Rock, Texas 78664. The phone number, if you want to call on in and pledge to be a recurring subscriber, is 800-724-2719, extension 03. Okay, now, very interesting development. As you know, one of the big stinks that came out of the Hillary Clinton private email server scandal was the realization that a lot of these officials, in order to evade public records laws, were conducting much of their business using aliases so that those particular emails wouldn't be captured and preserved in accordance with the laws that say all official emails must be kept and stored and made available to those who have a need to see them. Well, apparently the Department of Justice is now saying that former Attorney General Loretta Lynch used a fake name to conduct official Department of Justice business in agency emails obtained by Judicial Watch. Now, as the nation's chief law enforcement officer, Lynch, who was Obama's second Attorney General, skirted public records laws by using the alias Elizabeth Carlisle in emails she sent from her official Department of Justice account. In the records provided to Judicial Watch, the Department of Justice explains it as necessary to protect her security and privacy and enable her to conduct department business efficiently via email. You're not supposed to protect her privacy. She's a public official. There is no privacy. That's what the public records laws are all about. Transparency. And of course, this should start people wondering how many other government officials are using fake names to avoid public records laws or Freedom of Information Act requests. You know, send me all the files from Loretta Lynch here. If you don't mention this Elizabeth Carlisle, those files are not included in the Freedom of Information Act requests. Apparently, besides Lynch, Judicial Watch has discovered the use of aliases among government officials, such as at the Environmental Protection Agency. Obama's EPA administrator, Lisa Jackson, used the alias Richard Windsor. They're not playing by the rules over there. Not at all. Now, Hillary Clinton is back out in the public there. She's screaming, the Russians are coming, the Russians are coming. The Russians stole the election from me in 2016, and they're going to be stealing the election away from the Democrats here in November. And she's out there screaming, Donald Trump has surrendered to the Russians, and that proves he was in collusion with them. I do wish she'd shut her yap, because she's becoming an embarrassment, not just to the Democratic Party, but to the American people as a whole. I'm embarrassed to be from the same country as that woman. Now, here's an interesting little article. It's from Russia Insider. It's written by James Howard Kunstler. It's titled America's Descending into a Dangerous Psychosis. And he's basically commenting on how this obsessive focus on Russia borders on mental illness. Oh, so take all their guns away. And he's saying, forget about sharks. In their Valentine's Day editorial, Why Does Trump Ignore Top Officials' Warnings on Russia? The New York Times jumped several blue whales, a cruise ship, a subtropical archipelago, a giant vortex of plastic bottles, and the Sports Illustrated swimsuit shoot. And basically says that, yes, despite there being absolutely no evidence of interference with the 2016 election, certainly by Russia. We know there was interference by Israel and by the Democrats, but none by Russia that they can prove. That's still pushing that as hard as they can. And it's bordering on paranoia, or you're basically looking at part of the propaganda that is leading us to an eventual conflict with Russia, and that is already getting problematic. Remember Jake Tapper? When Donald Trump during the campaign came out and said, we've discovered we've been bugged, we're being spied on. And Jake Tapper, along with pretty much the rest of the media, just said, oh, come on, how ridiculous can you be? The idea that a candidate would be spied on, that is, well, Tapper still owes Trump a huge apology. And yes, as we learned in Watergate, candidates are spied on. And we now know it happened to Donald Trump. And they used that dodgy Russian dossier to trick the FISA court into issuing a warrant to make it look like it was quasi-legal. But that all happened after Trump came out with his accusations. They got the warrant after they started the bugging. They were just bugging like crazy, and then Trump started calling attention, and somebody said, we'd better get a warrant to make it all look legal. We're going to take a break here. We'll be right back after these words from our sponsors. Join us on the air, 800-313-9443. Aloha, America. Welcome back to our show here, and we've got a phone call. Mike in Kentucky, aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Just not sure how I ran across him, but the Kevin Shipp videos, I don't know if you've seen any of his presentations. He claims to have pretty good proof that he actually was, unlike some claimed to be an ex-CIA guy, and I don't know how you can do that. I've ran into people over the years that claim to be ex-NSA or whatever, but I didn't know if you'd ever thought about interviewing him or if you've seen any of his materials.
Okay,
Kevin
what was
Shipp.
the name again?
S-H-I-P, as in a ship in the night. Kevin Shipp. He's ex-CIA. His main topics are the shadow government, deep state, and the difference between the two. He goes through some of the history of how the CIA and the NSA were created by executive orders, and there's no real congressional oversight for any of it.
Well, there's supposed to be.
Like
That's what the House Intelligence Subcommittee is for. There's supposed to be oversight of what the agencies are doing. Of course, we know it's all a joke. The primary reason the CIA got into running drugs is they wanted a source of revenue where they didn't have to go to the Congress and ask for an appropriation, because then Congress would say, well, what are you going to spend the money on? And so the CIA has been involved in drug running at least as far back as Vietnam, when the French were forced to leave Vietnam. Remember the movie The French Connection? That was the source of the French Connection, was Vietnam. And so when France left and the U.S. went on in, the CIA took over control of that flow of Kun Sa's heroin and started smuggling it back to the United States inside the body bags of our Vietnam dead. And Hawaii was the tranship point because they didn't have aircraft that could cross the entire Pacific in a single flight. And that drug money kind of corrupted our local politics, and we feel the effects to the very, very day. But as far as it being a deep state or shadow state, well, we've kind of dragged them out of the shadows, and they're not looking very deep. It's kind of in your face right now what's really going on, and I think that's a good thing.
I think you're talking about Operation Scatback. I like Air America gets into that a little bit, and
yes.
Some other, I guess, contractors have come forward, like Terry Reed, I think
yes.
is his name, with the book Compromise. That's what Kevin Shipp points out, is that there's a lot of cross-party cooperation here, but, Bush, Clinton, Arkansas, Iran-Contra, and, as a prime example there.
Yes.
But I didn't know if you'd ever run across it. He's pretty long-winded, you have to watch about 2 hours of it to get it all, and then he says there's more, but of course, obviously, he's like a lot of these guys. He's kind of selling a book a little bit. Mentioned his book a few times, but and how much trouble he had getting it published, and the kind of risks he's taken by coming forward. And he's been doing this for about 3 or 4 years and still above room temperature. So I just didn't know if you'd run across that. I think that's true, though. They only get a warrant when they want to, when they're worried about their pension or going to jail. They go get these warrants after
yes.
the fact, and they do all kinds of whatever research or whatever they can call it besides an investigation or a formal operation. And so, like as depicted and sweeps under the Hancock software that AT&T has openly been marketing since about 2003. I think that this sort of stuff goes way back beyond the Patriot Act, from talking with engineers that were working on tracking these cell phones way back in the early 90s in the middle of nowhere where there's, very few cell towers.
It goes back all the way to the 1980s and something called Echelon. And
oh, yeah.
What they did back then was these 5 nations got together, and use their technology to intercept the communications of each other's citizens. Then they would trade the information, so that technically they were not in violation of laws that said that you're not allowed to just surveil and spy on our citizens. And it was a bit of a dodge, but they developed a lot of technology to basically grab telephone communications, right off the satellite feeds, right out of the air. When we first moved here on Oahu, there was this gigantic antenna array, all in a circle up in the middle of the island. It's been torn down now, and they've put the NSA data center there where Snowden actually worked is now located on that same piece of ground.
Booz Allen, I think, is who he worked for. But
yeah,
the national, there's overlapping agencies too. Besides the NSA, there's National Reconnaissance Office and the Geospatial people, and they all have satellite assets. If you look in after sunset or before sunrise, you can see a lot of these in polar orbits going by in like two clusters of 2 or 3, one, and then a few minutes later there comes another one. And they're in a polar orbit, like a very high-angle orbit, almost either coming from the extreme northwest or the extreme southwest, I think, is the way it goes. They kind of cross each other as they go over the middle latitudes. But that movie, Enemy of the State, makes reference to a lot of that. Came out in 1998. But one thing that I haven't even hardly seen William Binney or anybody talk about the concept that they're able to use these devices when they're off. That's CBS the other morning. I think it was Tuesday morning this week.
You're talking about our cell phones and our tablets and so forth.
Oh, exactly. Microphones are in devices you think are off, but they may not be, and that's what CBS brought up this week, and to which I said, duh. I mean, they act like this new discovery they just made, that some of the apps that you have on your phone may be listening to you when you least expect it and are serving you up advertisement based on what you talk about when you think the phone is off. And I've been blowing a whistle on that for 20 years and people wouldn't listen to it. Phone technicians. The thing about the echelon system, in 2001, before September 11th, the European Union issued a report on that in which they said, well, we don't think they're doing industrial espionage. They basically said, they didn't care about anybody's individual privacy. What they were worried about was industrial secrets being stolen.
Yes.
At least that's the gist I got of. And that was, of course, kind of forgotten about because of September 11th, I think. But
well, they had grounds. They had grounds for that concern because there was a big scandal when Claire and I were living in Washington State. It was a big stink where there's this organization called the Asia Pacific Economic Conference, and every couple of years they'll all get together, and it changes every year. They've had one here in Honolulu, and they had one in Seattle just about the time we first moved up there. And there was a big stink because it came on out that U.S. government agents were spying on conference attendees, breaking into their computers and stealing business secrets to give to Bill Clinton's cronies. So Bill Clinton's cronies would go into these meetings to bid on a contract, knowing what the other people were planning on bidding, and so they would win all these contracts. And it's very underhanded. And so, it sort of sent a signal to the rest of the world that America's spy agencies are actually working in industrial espionage for the benefit of favored, politically connected corporations.
I've heard you point this out, and of course, William Binney both pointing it out as well. A lot of this stuff is horrible for network security. Every one of these secret splitters, supposedly, they have splitters that can go, and I've talked to fiber optic technicians about it, and I can't nail them down, about how many times the signal can be split. And, once it gets split off of, AT&T or Quest or some, central office feed, how many times can that fiber optics be split? And you get these vague answers like, well, it depends on the power of the card. And they usually shut up when I say, what about backhauling signals? And once you split this off into the intelligence community's network, can they backhaul signals and get back into the network? And they usually hush at that point. They don't want to talk about the security issues there that they've let who knows how many spooks and ghosts in the machine by splitting off these feeds into the wild west of the intelligence community. One of the things that Kevin Shipp points out is once you join like the NSA or the CIA, you waive your rights to trial by jury. And I often thought about that. How can that be possible? That there's not even a military jury, or they have secret trials for people that go off the ranch. In that TV show Person of Interest, one of these guys gets discovered, as they say, behind enemy lines. They just put a bag over his head and shove him in a limousine, and he's gone. As one NSA guy or claimed to be NSA, we used to work at the Pentagon, says he saw people summarily executed because they were behind in an area of the Pentagon they weren't supposed to be, and they just shot them. And you never hear about that sort of stuff. Somebody being executed extrajudicially. I'm sure if it happens,
I think their families would kick up a huge stink. Anyway, Mike, thanks an awful lot. We're going to let you go. The lines are loading up, and we're going to switch over to Dustin in New Jersey. Aloha, Dustin. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Mike, what's on my mind is the Putin Sarmat missile. What do you think of that, huh, now?
Yeah, well... Well, I've been telling you for a while that Russia was developing these new maneuverable warheads, and it looks like now they're deployed and in service.
Now, Mike, you know a lot about the hypersonic glide vehicles. Now, is that once that goes up into the atmosphere, does that hypersonic glide vehicle have all those warheads on it? They're not individual hypersonic glide vehicles, are they, the warheads themselves?
No, they're reentry vehicles. They're conical shaped. They're probably not all that different from the ones currently in use. They're cone shaped, so they'll travel through the atmosphere. They're actually made out of a different isotope of uranium, and they actually add to the yield of the weapon. Plus, the metal itself is very resistant to heat.
And I want to talk about a few, if you have, before you go to... there's a system called Dagger. They're asking people to send in names for certain weapon systems, but there's one called Dagger, and I saw a video clip of a MiG-31 with a test dropping this thing. And it's supposed to be hypersonic. Something like, remember when Russia and India, they built that P-800 Onyx anti-ship missile, and then I think November or December, didn't they test one? They dropped it off of a plane. It was Su-30, I think they dropped it to test it. But Mike, did you hear about the cruise missile that they're working on that has a miniature nuclear reactor on it, like an energy source? Now, those cruise missiles would only be obviously fitted with like a tactical nuclear warhead, right? I mean, of course, I can't see that being used against like terrorists, into a building,
No, that sounds like a rather expensive strategic weapon. It doesn't strike me as being tactical. And my understanding about it is that it and the underwater drone are pretty much autonomous. And once they're launched, they're fire and forget weapons is basically what it is. The nuclear reactor on board makes sense to power the propulsion system. And that tells me that the one drawback of this Russian drone is it's probably traveling very, very slowly. Although there was, back in the 1950s, an attempt to create a rocket engine using a nuclear reactor as the source of heat. For not a rocket, a jet engine, where they would suck air in at the front, it would be exposed to the heat of the reactor, and then blast it out the back. Of course, it was abandoned because the air coming out of the back was hideously radioactive. But I guess if you're in World War III and it's the final showdown, that's not a factor any longer. The question I have about the underwater drone being autonomous and being able to travel like 6,000 miles is I'm wondering, how the heck do they navigate? Because while it's underwater, it can't receive GPS signals. And I know there's such a thing as an inertial navigation system, but they have accumulating round-off errors over time. And all of our submarines, every once in a while, they have to come to the surface and basically get a position fix. I do know that supposedly the Russians have really good undersea maps. So maybe this device navigates by sonaring off of terrain features, but then that would give it away its position. It's something I'm going to have to really think about.
I just think it's amazing how you can launch a cruise missile with a small miniaturized nuclear reactor, and it won't run out of fuel, Mike. It can fly around and look for other targets. That's incredible. I mean, that blows my mind.
Well, it's going to run out of fuel eventually. Probably it's going to be a while, but even our nuclear-powered submarines and aircraft carriers, every 3 to 5 years, they have to be put into dry dock and the reactors opened up and the fuel rods swapped out. The reactor control officers on these ships, they literally have to keep a very careful log about how much energy is being taken out of the reactor, because that tells them how much is still left. It's sort of like having the gas gauge on your car. They have to keep a close eye on that.
I think one of the missile systems they should call it should be the FU system.
Would certainly be appropriate.
System, you know? but so good for them, Mike. I mean, Cold War 2.0, I guess, started, huh?
Well, basically, Putin has taken the gloves off. I think he finally got fed up with all this talk about the U.S. coming to whip Russia's ass, and he basically stood up today and said, think very carefully about that. Now, I don't know how many of these new weapons he's got, whether they really live up to their claims. I'd like to have a lot more detailed information to do an evaluation on this stuff. But certainly we know that with the existing established weaponry, they have almost as many nuclear warheads in service as the United States does, and the Russians are larger. So if there's just an exchange of the existing weaponry, both nations are going to be wiped out. But we know we've been hearing for a long time that Russia had been working on a reentry vehicle for an ICBM, nuclear ICBM, that was maneuverable, that would evade all of the U.S. existing anti-missile strategies.
The computer on board that thing got to be incredible, Mike. I mean, to do the calculations that quick and swerve, and a piece of engineering, I think.
Well, believe it or not,
don't forget.
Believe it or not, the technology for maneuvering a cone-shaped object actually goes all the way back to the Mercury space program. And the idea was that you put the center of gravity slightly off to one side. So the vehicle would fly through the air at a slight angle. And, of course, it would push off in a direction. And all you have to do is roll in a different direction, and you change the direction it's moving. And, obviously the Russians are using the same technique and the same algorithms. Anyway, Dustin, got to let you go. Got to take a commercial break. Got another caller waiting on the line, and we'll be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. And before we go back to the phone lines here, remember when we were talking yesterday about Hope Hicks resigning from the White House? And I said, it feels like there may be a shakeup. It's just hitting the wires. Apparently, the White House is going to replace H.R. McMaster as National Security Advisor as early as next month. Well, I guess that, in a move apparently orchestrated by Chief of Staff John Kelly and Defense Secretary James Mattis. So, yeah, more turmoil over there in the White House. Okay, let's go back to the telephones now. We're going to talk to Jeff in Toronto. Aloha, Jeff. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hi there, Mike. Thanks a lot for taking my call. How are you doing today?
Doing fine.
Great. I just had a observation to make. It's about internet censorship.
Yes.
And Prince William came out the other day saying that the internet has to be clamped down on. I like conservative shows on YouTube, and Mark Dice has gotten a strike on his channel, Alex Jones, The Goldfish Report, Dr. Jim Fetzer, all these shows. And I'm just trying to find basic raw information about the shooting in Florida. But it just appears as though if you just challenge the narrative, then they're going to get a strike, you're going to get pulled down right away. And they're using like harassment as an excuse. And I'm just wondering how much of this has to do with the repeal of the Smith-Munt Act, which sort of allows propaganda to be used in the country when it was allowed to be used previous to that outside of the United States.
Well, it's still allowed to be used outside the United States of America. They just sort of took all the legal American citizens and said, you're all now to be treated like you're enemies of the state. The censorship is out there. Everybody's seeing it happen. Apparently, some of these social media platforms are now starting to go back and delete all the posts questioning the official story of Sandy Hook. And no doubt they're going to proceed on to people who question the official story of the Boston Marathon bombing. And who knows, at some point they might go after my website because I question the official verdict of suicide in the death of Vince Foster. But again, every time they do it, people are noticing and they're paying attention. And as I've said many times before, the fastest way to bring down a dictatorship is to force them to act like one where everybody can see it.
Well, I agree. I think that's why they're shooting themselves in the foot, so to speak, because like when you try to do these internet searches or you're trying to find programs on YouTube, for example, just to try to get raw information about not just necessarily Florida, but other instances of gun shootings and that sort of thing, they're getting pulled down. So it just makes you question, why are they doing it if they're, evidently if you look at these shows or you look at the narrative, they're not really being bullying. They're just actually questioning the narrative. So for them to actually go overboard and just to pull these shows down just for merely questioning a narrative makes you really think, or should make the public think, that there's something really going on here. And, like, I forget the name of the shooter in Florida, but...
Nicholas Cruz.
I think Nicholas Cruz. And one of the witnesses, though, was Hogg, was his name?
David Hogg.
On these different
he's the crisis actor. His father's former FBI. His father now currently works for a company that creates simulations for shooting events, and Hogg's mother is a VIP at CNN. That's why he's getting all this airtime.
Yeah.
Okay. Anyway, Jeff, we got to let you go. We got to do a station break. We'll be back after these few words with more news and more phone calls. So stay tuned. And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show, hour number 2. Getting on back to the very obvious media bias against Donald Trump. Somebody pointed out that CNN's approval rating for Trump is 15 points lower than Rasmussen's. Now, in theory, these approval ratings are done by surveying the general population, and they should be relatively close to each other. I mean, yes, there's a margin for error depending upon how large a sample that you're doing. The larger the sample, the more accurate it's going to be. But 15 points? That's bias. That's definitely bias. Now, do you remember Cheryl Atkinson? She used to work for CBS, and when she was reporting on the Benghazi scandal, she came on out and basically said her computers were being hacked into. And CBS News spokeswoman Sonia McNair said at the time that a cybersecurity firm hired by CBS News has determined through forensic analysis that Atkinson's computer was accessed by an unauthorized, external, unknown party on multiple occasions in late 2012. Well, there was subsequently investigation, and now Cheryl Atkinson is saying that the Obama Department of Justice swapped out the hard drive while they had the computer in their possession. And I don't know if it was really obvious or they copied all the files as a logical copy, but they wanted to get rid of what remained of that forensic evidence, possibly. But again, it's a lot of skullduggery going on over there in Washington, D.C. Now, apparently, a Massachusetts man has been charged with sending a threatening letter filled with white powder to Donald Trump Jr. that apparently sent his wife to the hospital, along with 4 other bizarre letters mailed to a California prosecutor, a law professor, a senator, and actor Antonio Sabato Jr. Now, this guy, Daniel Ricilio, 24, was arrested after what prosecutors called a textbook federal investigation that traced the unsigned letters to him after he also ordered a glitter bomb for one of the recipients using his own name. Well, that was stupid to do. Apparently, this guy is a Adam Schiff supporter. And the first question that comes to my mind is, what prescription psychiatric medication is he on? Because this does not even live in the same time zone as rational, thoughtful behavior. Now, as you know, just recently, the case against the Bundys was thrown out by Judge Navarro, Gloria Navarro, basically in January, dismissed with prejudice, this whole case that was going on. And a lot of people are still wondering, what was that all about? What was that really all about? And what it was about was the greed of a certain Senator Reid, Harry Reid. And what happened was that Harry Reid wanted to cash in on the Obama taxpayer-funded solar energy products. And he got into a partnership with a Chinese energy giant, ENN, and they wanted to build a solar panel factory there in the middle of Nevada. And they wanted the land that Bundy was grazing his cattle on. So it was a classic case of a land snatch, right out of Blazing Saddles. Bundy's only offense was he was grazing his cattle on open land in Nevada that his family had used for decades. And Senator Reid was willing to allow the Department of Justice to engage in prosecutorial misconduct so he could grab for himself and his family a fortune derived from the solar energy. Now, when the solar energy fiasco failed, the Obama administration had to keep pushing the prosecution of the Bundys to cover up what this is really all about. And that's the backstory. And everybody thought Judge Navarro, who was an Obama appointee, was just going to send the Bundys away and that was going to be it. And she surprised everybody. And she said the prosecutorial misconduct was just too blatant to be ignored, and she dismissed the charges with prejudice, which means the Bundys cannot be tried again. That's the backstory on that. All right, let's grab a phone call here from Nick in England. Aloha, Nick. Welcome to the show. And I'll bet you're going to talk about how cold it is.
Oh, how did you guess? I was going to surprise you.
I'm a mind reader. How do you do? You're very pleased to meet me.
Yeah. Amazing. Yes, indeed. Yeah. Well, you'll be delighted to know that I'm nice and warm and snug in my flat here. And children are nicely warm and in bed. And it's an igloo outside. It's incredible. I mean, it's been freezing for the last week or so. And, you know, it's sub-zero out there. It's like we're in Siberia or Canada or somewhere. But, you know, it's like the whole country has been, it's the whole country. I mean, London, you know, it's working, but there's limited bus services, limited train services, and so on. And I'm down here in the southwest of England, and, you know, where I live, there's actually a really nice little microclimate where it's actually quite a decent climate here. And, you know, one of the local towns nearby has actually got a few palm trees. You know, it's remarkable. But this whole area, there's a red warning, which is the highest level for danger area. And I got a mate who's lived here in this part of the world for 37 years. And he said about 10 years ago, there was a little bit of light snow in this town. But it went after a couple of days. It was light. And it's just been snowing all day. It was snowing yesterday. It's been snowing all day today. I mean, stunningly beautiful, but there's just abandoned buses and cars everywhere. It's absolutely amazing. It's just remarkable. I mean, some of the country has gone down to minus 16 degrees. So I've been scouring the BBC and the press out here. I'm trying to find references to global warming, but I have to. I'm really sorry to tell you, I haven't been able to find any.
Well, they're trying to figure out a way. They're still pushing this idea that global warming is why we're getting these harsh winters now. And of course, in the 1990s, global warming is why we're never going to see harsh winters again. And it's like they blame the Russians for everything. Whether it gets hotter, it's global warming. Whether it gets colder, it's global warming.
I hadn't thought it might be the Russians' fault. That hadn't occurred to me.
Well, somebody actually came up with that and said that along with all of their fancy new nuclear weapons, Russia has a cold beam, and they're using it to freeze the rest of the world. That's why it's the new Cold War.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, I'm going to be scouring the scientific press here in Britain, because I bet you at some point later this year there'll be some paper will be produced. It'll say, "Hey, this is the hottest year on record."
Oh, they're already saying that about last year, and we had record snow there. I mean, the lies are just becoming so obvious, you know. And I don't know if they're still pushing it because they think we're all going to agree to let a global environmental authority run our lives, or if they still think they're going to succeed in getting a carbon tax on us, or if they're just trying to save face by not having to admit how completely wrong they were on this.
Do you think we should be burning a bit more, increasing our carbon footprint Is that what we need to do?
Well, unfortunately, it turns out that Al Gore and the carbon Nazis were wrong, and this actually comes from NASA. Carbon dioxide actually acts as an atmospheric coolant. But I think what's going on right now is the sun is just getting a little dimmer and dimmer. Apparently the forecasts are it's actually going to lose a significant part of its energy before it starts to regain the cycle. This is a repeat of the little ice age that we're going into. And that means the winter fair is going to come back on the Thames. The big problem, of course, is having enough energy to keep all of the huge and growing populations of Europe alive. And I understand that already there's a gas shortage in Great Britain that's been caused by this incredible storm.
They're talking about it. They're saying that tomorrow they may announce, the Met Office might announce here that today's been the coldest day in March since records began. But what strikes me about this, I mean, the last time I had a conversation with my favorite social justice warrior, the conversation came around to climate change, and I said to her, actually, I always thought it was global warming, so-called. But it was an incredibly deeply unsatisfying conversation. I mean, when I told her that I was very skeptical about global warming, and I thought it was all a bit of a big hoax, she looked at me like I'd grown an extra head or something. And then she went into a hysterical rant about Trump pulling out of the Paris Accord. And I said, well, good for him. I mean, why not? And the look on her face, I mean, she was ready to commit me to a lunatic asylum. I mean, it's a religious cult for these people.
It is.
That's the only way I can describe it.
It is. I mean, liberalism in gender is caught up in a fantasy world, and they seem to believe that if they just believe in these fantasies enough, it will come to pass. No, I'm sorry. You've all been screaming the world is warming. Look out the window. And how are you going to I imagine probably a lot of these liberal global warming people are being triggered. They look out the window and they have to get out their Play-Doh or those little plastic pop buttons and go into therapy.
Well, I said to her at this point, look, I mean, don't you think that if you're going to discuss the temperature of the Earth, don't you think that it's relevant the distance of the sun from the Earth is a relevant factor? At which point she just kind of, just got hysterical with me and changed the subject and almost started screaming at me, like, the usual liberal reaction. I then, brought the subject back. I said, well, don't you, I mean, use your analytical mind. I mean, I wanted to say if you have one, but I was far too, discreet to say something like that. And then just apply a little bit of analytical logic. But, there's no sense of having a reasoned conversation with these people. That's what I find so profoundly disturbing.
No, it's it is a cult. It's been turned into a personality cult. They just have something that they believe, and they're warriors fighting for it. They're fighting against human-caused global warming, no matter how much snow is coming on down. They're fighting for men to be able to use the women's room, and so forth and so on. And they just get caught up in this idea that they're on a modern crusade, and that somehow they're correcting the wrongs of society, when in point of fact, they're only making things worse.
Yeah. There was an interesting BBC debate on climate change or global warming last year, and of course all the people on there were just, they read the party line. It was on the BBC. They had to have one person on there that was nominally showing the other side, and they had Piers Corbyn, who is the brother of Jeremy Corbyn. Jeremy Corbyn, of course, is beloved of the BBC because he's a wonderful socialist, and they think he's, a great person because of that, not some ghastly right-winger. And so Piers Corbyn, you would have thought that they would have accorded him a certain degree of respect. I mean, he's a respected meteorologist. He's a total, he doesn't believe in climate change in any way, shape, or form. But the way that he was treated on this debate was shocking. It was like he had leprosy or something. They wouldn't let him finish sentences or interrupting him the whole time. The moderator was doing this. And even somebody who's that related to somebody who, like Corbyn, who they love and adore, they treated even him despicably. And so there is just there's no way of having a reasoned debate at all.
They don't want to have a reasoned debate. They understand the reason for the hysterics and the media manipulation and this kind of abuse of doubters is they know they can't have a rational debate. They will lose. the numbers are against them. Starting at the end of the 1990s, they started trying to rig the data, and now it's all come on out. And even today, we're seeing these reports coming where NOAA, again, is found cooking the books, trying to keep selling this idea that the world is getting warmer and that humans are to blame. And the fact of the matter is that climate does change all by itself. It always has, it always will. There's never been a time in the history of planet Earth where the climate wasn't changing. But Al Gore did a typical political thing. He took something that's happening normally and naturally, declared it to be a disaster, and then offered to sell everybody the solution. And then Mother Nature went the other way on him.
Yeah, very inconvenient. Well, they used to grow wide. They used to several hundred years ago, in the north of England. I mean, of course, climate's always changed. It's anyway. I'm just going to have a lot of fun in the next few weeks talking to various people saying, "Do you still believe in global warming?" It's going to it'll give me a little bit of amusement anyway.
It certainly will, and I'll tell you what would also give me amusement is if you take pictures. If you could send some along to me.
Oh, I'd be delighted to. And as I say, this little town here, where I live, 37 years my mates lived here. 10 years ago, there was a tiny little bit of snow. And today, there's just been a blizzard all day, and it was yesterday. And it's beautiful, but it's utterly, utterly unprecedented. Yeah, and of course, in England, we're just not prepared for it. They don't have the ability to clear the roads in a hurry, and there's so many road closures around here. We clearly, we don't pay enough tax. There's not enough ability to deal with the infrastructure.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, I guess the British government could take some of that money they put into nuclear weapons, and they could, pop one off really high overhead to melt the snow, and hopefully the radiation won't be too much of a problem. Anyway, Nick, stay warm, stay safe, and
great. Thanks, nice to talk to you, and send my best to the Lady Claire. I hope she gets better very soon.
She is getting better, slow but sure. All right, we're going to switch over to Laura in Michigan. Aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
I was going to say to that fellow in England, I thought that because the Gulf of Mexico, that oil disaster, that it disrupted the Gulf Stream, and that England was going to be cold from now on because they were getting the Gulf Stream warped.
Well, no. In point of fact, no. The Gulf Stream wasn't disrupted; it was toxified, and a lot of areas that rely on fishing on the eastern seaboard and the Gulf of Mexico, they're going out of business. They can't catch any seafood that anybody wants to eat. But the fact is, the cold snap is not just hitting England. They've got a major one underway in the southern Great Plains states and the Pacific Northwest, record-setting cold there. And obviously, those areas are not affected by the Gulf Stream.
Also, while we're talking about England, a couple of Fridays ago on Restore the Republic, it's on after Kelso's show, they had a talk show host from Great Britain. He loves Donald Trump. He said Donald Trump was the first president that he felt was his president also. But the thing was, this guy, his name is Graham. He has a constitutional group in England, and they try to fight the corrupt parliament. And the Fabians, he said, he fights the Fabians over there in England.
Yes.
Anyway, a couple of cute things that he does. They're very activist-minded. One thing they did was they built a gallows and put it on a trailer. So whenever a corrupt politician is speaking somewhere, they go and park it in front of wherever they're speaking. And the sign on the gallows says, "This is what happens to corrupt and treasonous politicians." And then the other thing that they do is whenever there's one of the politicians are out speaking, they call their equivalent of 911. I can't remember what the number was. And they'll say, "We want a citizen's arrest of so-and-so for treason," or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
That's how they get some. They get a lot of reaction to that. I thought it was kind of cute what they did.
Yeah, it's also illegal to call the police and say you want some, or well, if they're talking citizen's arrest for treason. You got to be really careful. You could very quickly, in the enthusiasm, cross a line and find yourself in some legal trouble. And probably we probably need some kind of a guidebook for modern activists that say, this is what you're allowed to do, this is what's protected by the First Amendment, these are the things you should not do. And I'm sure they're already out there, because every time we go to a protest, the organizers are already out there saying, remember, there are going to be infiltrators, they're going to be agent provocateurs. If there's somebody in your midst who's urging violence, you just form a circle around them and point at them and call for help from our security people. Because these things are a reality. Anyway, listen, thank you very much. We're going to let you go. And we're going to start with Richard in Washington, but I'm going to have to take you through the commercial break. Richard, what's on your mind?
Well, I was just giving you kudos for the fact that there was a double Michael presentation today. You're both right on target. And the thing that I wanted to bring out was the fact that we talk as if media disinformation and martial law and all these other terms are just happening in our generation. But if you actually study the history, you can take this all the way back. There's a book called Ubuntu, which shows us the first way to control the masses was the creation of money.
Okay, Richard, got to put you on hold.
Sure.
Got to do commercials.
Okay.
I'll come right back to you after these words from our sponsor. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. We're talking with Richard in Washington. And Richard, you were talking about control over people, and you made the comment that the first way of controlling people was the invention of money, and I have to disagree with that. Throughout all of human history, there have been those few who feel that they have a right to control everybody else around them, and they'll use whatever is available. It may be money, it may be media, it could be this big club that you have just at the doorway of your cave. That is unfortunately the reality of human nature.
Oh, no, I fully support that. What I'm saying was one of the first ways they started doing it way, way, way back was money. Then it came to, like I said, with the Roman Empire, food. They turned us on to carbohydrates versus hunter-gatherer materials that are actually more designed for health. And while we're on that subject, I mentioned on Michael Herzog's show a book called Why We Sleep. I recommend that for everybody. The only things we have control over, even though we're trying to be controlled by the powers that be, is over our health. And that's systematically being destroyed.
Yes.
And one of the ways that we can regain some control is by controlling our input into our own bodies. And sleep is the most significant input that we don't really realize how significant that is. Second being diet, and third being exercise. But those things we do have control over, and we should really concentrate on those, because the more healthy we are, the better we are to have clear minds and be able to recognize the facts of control. But what I brought up on Michael's show was a book called The Secret of the Incas by William Sullivan, and then a book called The Book of Hiram by Christopher Knight and Robert Loomis. And what both of these books point out was there was a culture way before the biblical cultures, even the Sumerians and the Babylonians. They were called, I think it was the grooved ware people. And
yeah,
basically,
they were in Britain.
we don't get any notice of them.
Well,
yeah,
that's because we can't figure out who they were. I mean, there's nothing to say. Yes, they were here. They made this ceramic pottery with grooves in it, from which they get the name grooveware. They haven't found anything else about it because, like the people of Hawaii, they didn't leave anything that survived and preserved. The ancient Hawaiians made everything out of palm fronds and the soft wood of the trees. Very little rock carving. Unless you go down to Easter Island or Tahiti, and those monuments all survived. But we don't know who built Göbekli Tepe. They're still trying to figure that out. I'm absolutely convinced there's a lot more human history out there. We have no clue it was there. There could have been advanced civilizations before the last great ice age that just got ground into dust by the glaciers, and we'll never know that they were there.
Exactly, and that's what I keep trying to point out is we don't know exactly when the first attempts at control over us took place and how significant they were, because these cultures, like you pointed out, either didn't have a written language, didn't have any way to document that written language, or whatever, and then we just assumed these civilizations were dumb and savage or whatever. but you actually study what little remnants we have of their civilizations, they were more sophisticated than we were. They were tracking the cosmos, and the main one was they had a length of time that was, it was called the megalithic yard, that was used for all these stone structures that we still have, and we don't know who built or whatever. We just tack that on to ignorance. But basically, if you do study it, what you find is these people were tracking the cosmos so they could enhance their growth of food and
Yes.
enhance the time of
We
day.
still do that today with
and they found out that
we still do that today with the Farmer's Almanac. I mean, I grew up as a farm kid. I understand the importance of knowing the right time to plant and the right time to harvest. Obviously, these ancient societies, they didn't have the type of distractions that we have. So, yeah, the sky was entertainment as well as being a calendar for the growing season. But again, I know exactly when the first attempt at control over us began, and it was illustrated quite splendidly in Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey, when that first man-ape picked up that bone and clubbed the other man-ape into submission. That kind of behavior existed long before money, long before anything else. The idea of control by one human over another, that's part of human nature. And you can't just say it's because of food, or it's because of religion, or it's because of money. Those who seek control will use whatever is out there that they can use to exercise control. Fear, the fear of the terrorists, fear of the Russians. They're trying to use that one on us right now. The use of lies and misinformation to keep us seeing the world differently than it really is. But again, the ability to control is not predicated on any of the methods being used. It is simply part of human nature. And it always has been, and sadly, unfortunately, it always will be. And our founding fathers tried to set up a government that was going to be somewhat safe from this natural instinct of ambitious people. And it did last about 200 years. Unfortunately, it's in serious trouble now. Richard, I got to let you go. We got to do another commercial break, and we'll be back after these words from our sponsors. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here, and we're way behind on the talking points, so let me get some news out here. Apparently, representatives from the United States, Britain, France, Saudi Arabia, and Jordan, just those 5 countries, met last January in Washington, D.C. to draw up their new plans for the Middle East. And obviously, Ankara is alarmed that this new plan for the Middle East does not include Turkey. I'm sure Assad feels exactly the same way. This is a redo of World War I. Go into the Middle East, conquer it all, redraw the borders to the advantage of outsiders, and just go ahead. Now, interesting little article came out of the original antiwar.com. Syria, are we in or out? And they're pointing to these conflicting memorandum that keep coming on out. On February 11th, SecDef Mattis stressed that with ISIS defeat, there's no plan for a deeper U.S. commitment in Syria. And then several weeks later, on February 23rd, Donald Trump said pretty much the same thing, saying that the 1,700 to 2,000 U.S. troops in the country would go home after ISIS had been beaten. Well, that didn't happen. In a pair of letters issued just recently, Pentagon and State Department officials indicated the Trump administration envisions U.S. soldiers remaining on the ground in Syria and Iraq indefinitely, even after Islamic State militants have been defeated, and does not believe it needs additional permission from Congress to do so. Well, it is obvious right now that because of the deep state hatred for Donald Trump, they're not really listening to him. And part of the president's job is to create a unified policy. And so what we have here is the government, the institutional government, starting to fragment and factionalize, each pushing their own agenda. And we shouldn't be willing to accept anything that any agency or the Pentagon says that Trump is thinking. We need to wait for Trump himself to come on out and tell us. because a lot of people are apparently being very loosey-goosey with quoting him, and we need to be very, very careful about that. Now, apparently the Syrian army has overrun the militant defenses in eastern Ghouta, and apparently the militants continue to sabotage the daily humanitarian pauses, which were started on the 27th. Basically what it is the militants are using snipers to keep the civilians in Ghouta scared and in their homes, because they want to be able to say, oh, look, Assad is killing civilians, Russia is killing civilians. And of course, the whole idea of the humanitarian pause is to let the civilians get out, but the militants will not let them go. The U.S. has deployed 600 additional troops in Syria's At-Tanf, adjacent to the Iraqi border, and it's comprised of special forces soldiers that's arrived at the base at At-Tanf, which was established by the U.S. 2 years ago, which is kind of weird when you consider that Syria doesn't want them there. In fact, right now, according to government slaves, the U.S. has built 20 military bases in Syria's Kurdish-held north. That's a lot of military bases. And apparently these new U.S. forces at Tanf is saying that they have arrived with armored vehicles. So it's a heavy deployment here. The U.S. is threatening a guerrilla war against Russia in Syria. The U.S. is going to provide military aid to any force fighting the legitimate Syrian government. Seems to me that we got into one of these proxy guerrilla wars with Russia once before, back in this place called Vietnam, and it just didn't really work out all that well. Story out of Sputnik News. Western media coverage of Syria, a big, bright, shining lie. Well, of course, truth is always the first casualty of war. And yeah, we're being fed all this propaganda. The government is giving these professional liars and trolls tens of millions of dollars of your money to lie to you and to trick you and to deceive you. And the corporate media coverage of the conflict in eastern Ghouta leaves much to be desired. And what's really going on the ground in Ghouta is not being reflected in the Western media narrative. Remember the other day we reported on this so-called Syrian activist who went out with this Facebook post to bring awareness to the suffering of the civilians of Syria under that evil Assad. And then he got busted because the pictures he was using were actually taken in Gaza and Mosul. Story out of Sputnik News again. A representative of the U.S. mission to the United Nations has stated Washington will continue telling the world about Iran's actions until Tehran halts its activities. Meanwhile, U.S. Ambassador to the UN Nikki Haley has said that the U.S. and its partners will take actions on their own if Russia is going to continue to cover for Iran. Well, here is the issue. We're hearing a lot of claims that Iran did this and Iran did this and Iran is terrible, blah, 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 blah. Exactly the same stuff we heard before the U.S. went into Afghanistan, exactly the same thing we heard before the U.S. went into Iraq, exactly the same thing we heard when the U.S. was going into Syria. And we know it's all USDA choice bovine excrement. So basically what Nikki Haley is saying is that if Russia doesn't go along with our lies, we're going to be unilateral. Now, the Russian foreign minister is once again accusing the United States of violating the terms of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Basically saying that by training NATO allies to use U.S. nuclear arms installed on European territory. Now, here's what's going on. Those NATO nations do not have their own nuclear weapons. They are not signatories to the NNPT. And the U.S. is turning them into proxy nuclear armed states. They're really going to do it. They're really going to do this. Now, Putin is taking off the gloves here. As you know, the new U.S. nuclear posture allows a nuclear attack in response to a conventional attack, which means if Russia were to bomb one of our bases in the Middle East, under this new nuclear posture, Trump has the authority to launch a nuclear strike on Russia. Putin has come on out and said, if the United States uses a nuke against Russia, Russia will respond in kind. They're just going to uncork on both sides. Now, during Russia's equivalent of the State of the Union speech, Putin came on out and basically said that America's attempt to prevent Russia from acquiring new weapons has failed. And he said all the sanctions, all of the blockading, all of this stuff was an attempt to reduce Russia to being weaker than the United States, and the United States has failed. Now, as I mentioned with that caller before, right now in terms of nuclear warheads actually in service, both countries have stockpiles where they're stored, but they're not in a position to be fired. Russia has almost as many as the United States, and theirs tend to be larger. So basically, Russia has unveiled 3 new weapons, or confirmed them. We've been actually talking about some of them for a while now, but it's officially confirmed. And the first one is a new ICBM, very long range, very intelligent, able to steer. NATO has designated it the Satan II. Make it sound really evil and nasty. And Putin is out there saying that this missile is designed to evade all Western anti-missile systems. And we have been talking for quite some time, months, maybe years, about word that Russia had developed a maneuverable re-entry vehicle for their MIRV warheads. Now, all of the U.S. ballistic missile defense, all of the Western missile defense, Patriot, Iron Dome, THAAD, are based on a doctrine of a predictable inbound ballistic path. You track it with radar, you have a little computer that says, okay, at this point in time, this warhead will be at this location, that's your aiming point. But with a maneuverable warhead, these systems are obsolete because the warhead is dipsy-doodling and it's corkscrewing and it's weaving back and forth and it's going up and down. And the little onboard navigation computer is going to make sure it hits where it's supposed to hit. But on its way there, it's going to follow an unpredictable path. Now, the second weapon that has been declared is apparently a nuclear-powered cruise missile. And I finally got to see the demonstration video of this. And yeah, it appears that Russia has revived the American design of using a fission reactor as an energy source in a jet turbine engine. So it doesn't need kerosene. It's using uranium. And again, this was something the U.S. developed back in the 50s. I think they called it Project Orion. I may be hazy on that one, but apparently it gives this cruise missile incredibly long range, and of course it is also nuclear armed. The third one is this autonomous drone, underwater drone, that can be launched from a submarine or an aircraft. It's also nuclear powered, which means it can swim for thousands and thousands of miles. It is autonomous and apparently can be used to hunt down and attack an entire fleet of ships. Yes, it's got a nuclear warhead. So we'll see. It is scary how close we are to all of this. Now, Putin also came on out and said that Russia has succeeded in developing a usable hypersonic craft. That means a vehicle that travels anywhere between Mach 8 and maybe Mach 25, which is orbital speed, I might add, and is able to sustain that. And we know that China's been developing one. There have actually been videos of it that made the internet. We know the U.S. has been trying to develop one. They were trying to develop one back in the 1980s with what was then called the scramjet program. But Russia is saying they have achieved theirs. They've got theirs running, and it's ready to go. So the gloves have come on off, and I think Putin is trying to send a message. Don't get into a fight that you can't win, which is also the same thing I am saying. Because we've been hearing all these horrible reports about American weapons, how much they cost. how badly they work. We're hearing now that the two classes of littoral combat ships, the Freedom class and the Independence class, they're just going to be scrapped. They can't get the modular weapon system to work correctly. They're going to go back to the drawing board. All it takes is money. And yet somehow the Russians, with much less military spending and dealing with sanctions, are able to put out some very terrifying pieces of hardware. Turkey is still making noises about wanting to invade the Greek islands that used to belong to the Ottoman empires, and their argument is that if you look at the islands, you can still see all the mosques and all the other architectural remains of the Ottoman Empire. And I don't know, with Turkey possibly coming into the crosshairs of the United States and Great Britain and Saudi Arabia and Jordan, and I forget the fifth one up there, you'd think they'd sort of develop a sense of perspective. Now, as you know, Benjamin Netanyahu is dealing with this corruption case. A lot of his associates have already been arrested. At least one of them has agreed to turn state's evidence against him. And the Israeli media, which actually the one that involves part of the corruption, favorable treatment in exchange for positive country, are out there trying to write articles projecting Netanyahu's crimes onto the Palestinians by saying, basically, shame on those Palestinian journalists who applauded and admired the fact that Netanyahu was now being arrested. You know, that's bad journalism. We shouldn't be listening to them. Well, how about if we talk about the corruption rather than people's reaction to the corruption? Because that really is the story. Now, if you're a shortwave listener, and I was as a kid, built a nice little Heathkit shortwave radio with glass tubes in it, which actually lasted until we were living in Washington State. And it was actually still working. I gave it away to a neighbor who wanted to get into shortwave. So you're familiar with the Voice of America, which is a well-known U.S. propaganda channel that broadcasts to the rest of the world. And a lot of people are starting to realize just how out there they are, because Voice of America is now claiming that Israel wants to help Gaza. And that is a real bizarre take on reality, because Israel, more than any other state in the world, has led the charge in reducing Gaza to economic desperation. And this claim that Israel is trying to help Gaza flies in the face of 10 years of an Israeli siege and 3 devastating wars. Which is why, even if I were into shortwave today, I would not be listening to Voice of America. Article that came out of Desert Peace, basically describing how Israel is very clearly descending into fascism. And Steve Amsel is saying it may not be too late to turn it around, but he's saying too much tears and blood have already been shed. And descent into fascism tends to be a one-way street. It tends to be permanent until that fascism collapses. We certainly saw that in Italy. We've seen it in every other fascistic country. And Israel is hardly alone in the idea of a nation that was once a republic or democratic sinking into fascism, because we have that problem here right now. We really, really do. Now, this is a piece of Warbeck's bovine excrement, and it's a claim that North Korea is sending missile and chemical weapons parts to Syria. Oh, those bad North Koreans, they're sending these parts to Syria. And this is coming out of this report, supposedly by United Nations experts. It's already been leaked to news organizations, but not released publicly. So all we're hearing about what's in this report is what the corporate media tells us. And there have been cases before where the corporate media will say, this United Nations report says this and that, and then when it's finally made public, we find out there was some exaggeration going on. So please keep that in mind. Anyway, we're going to take a break for commercials. We'll be right back after these words from our sponsors. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here. And again, back to that story, Warbeck's North Korea sending missile chemical weapons parts to Syria. I think what this is, they're trying to manufacture a link between North Korea and Syria to justify attacking North Korea, because they don't really have anything to go on. North Korea hasn't done anything other than to prepare to defend itself. And by the way, have you noticed how much U.S. foreign policy has come to resemble a gangster movie? You know, like the Godfather movies, you know, get rid of your nuclear weapons or we're going to put a horse's head in your bed. All right, we're going to go to the phones here. Terry in California, aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hey, Mike, I just want to comment about that Florida shooting. Maybe it wasn't so much the police outside was afraid to go in too early. Maybe they said, you know, don't go in too early because we want to get some more casualties. The more the better.
Yeah.
And wait till firing starts tapering off before you go in there. And the guy had 33 years anyway and he was probably ready to retire. When they said he quit, he probably just retired, you know, because he was probably going to do it anyway. So,
well, I imagine he probably got a handsome payoff, and he's going to go enjoy his money now. But yes, very clearly, keeping the medics out of the building was intended to maximize the body count for this last push for a gun ban, as well as to make sure that the medics did not see the real shooters, because that wasn't supposed to happen. Everybody was supposed to be cowering under their desks, and we had this one teacher who saw the shooters. And by the way, apparently there is a photo out there now of 3 of these guys dressed this way, you know, unloading their stuff into a car, taken apparently by a student. And here's where it gets interesting. This teacher said she thought it was a police officer, but here's where it falls apart, because police, SWAT, FBI, when they wear that kind of equipment, there's always an identifying logo sprayed on the front and the back. And this outfit didn't have any of that, according to the teacher.
Yeah, is that video still on YouTube, or they take it down? I heard talking.
Which video is that one?
Well, I saw it, I think, on YouTube, where she was saying she went face-to-face with the teacher and had his face covered.
The video's been taken off YouTube, but it's been put up all kinds of other places. I've even been sent a hard copy of it, which I'm going to keep just in case.
The same thing with that girl said there was definitely more than one shooter, right? She was talking to him, and they were shooting on the other side of the school.
That's right. She was talking to she was talking to the accused shooter, Nicholas Cruz. That one's being taken down. They're trying really, really hard to keep this story going. And by the way, a member just posted that, yes, already the gun grabbers are using that teacher in Georgia who fired a shot in his classroom to say, see, arming the teachers is a bad idea. Only a gun grab will fix this. Only confiscation only banning guns and ending the Second Amendment. That's the only possible solution. All right, anyway.
Yeah, well, he had a pistol, too, so they're probably going to collect those, too.
Oh,
okay,
yeah,
Mike.
No, the gun grabbers want all the guns. They even want the black powder muskets. We've got to take a break for station identification. Thank you for the call, Terry. We'll be back with more phone calls. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. We're going to go back to the phone lines, and we're going to start with Harry in Alaska. Aloha, Harry. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Greetings. Well, one thing, you and I have a little bit in common. I was born in New Hampshire. You lived in New Hampshire.
Yes.
And I would, I went to grammar school in the 1940s from in Maine, and I moved to California in 1953 after 7 years, and discovered that what I was being taught I'd already learned in the 3rd grade back in Maine.
Yes.
And so that was sort of the end of my formal education. However, the other night I was listening to that sheriff down there in Parkland talking about children shouldn't have guns. 18-year-old children shouldn't have guns, and
unless they join the army,
of course. My 17th birthday, on the 17th birthday, they put me. I joined the army. They came 5 months later. I could shoot rifles, machine guns, flamethrowers, rocket launchers, hand grenades. They taught me and jump out of airplanes. And I was 17 and a half, so I guess I was a child. I stayed there for I stayed there for 6 years, and the Army at that time was a lot of draftees. About half of them were draftees. When young men were in their senior year of high school there in the 50s, the conversation was, what branch of the service do you intend to go into? Because you either join Navy, Marine Corps, or you volunteered for the draft and did your 2 years and got your time over. Basically, we were all fairly fit at that age. We're talking about the Army that we have now, and you talk about the airplanes are a wreck and on and on and on, all the big machinery that they've put together that doesn't work. Well, you have an Army. I look at the Army, and it's just, we can't possibly ever win a war with this Army that we have.
I agree.
If it's a combat, and looking at I don't know about women in combat. I do know, and the children thing there were, I think, 10% of the names on the wall were teenagers, and I think there's eight women on the wall. They're all nurses.
Yes.
And it's, if you look at it, I see all those young girls down there in that school. I can't imagine. I know why we don't have the draft. I got out of the Army 3 weeks before JFK was murdered, and I didn't go to Vietnam, but I did know there were guys drafted. In 6 months, you're over in Vietnam after you got drafted. And I became against the draft because the Vietnam War was ridiculous.
Yes.
But I think I'm almost back to where they need to draft, but I can't believe they could draft women.
Well, they go back and forth on that. They go back and forth on that. The legislation for a new draft has been sitting in committee for years, going all the way back to the start of the Afghanistan war. And every once in a while, they'll bring up that debate about drafting women into combat roles or drafting women but only for non-combat roles. But I'll tell you, when they bring back the draft, that's what's really going to galvanize the American people, like it did back during Vietnam. And they're going to stand up and say, this has gone on long enough. It's, one thing when you've got kids who volunteer for the military and they get what they deserve and so forth and so on, which is not really accurate, because what we have in this country right now in many places is an economic draft where the government has so wrecked the economy that these kids coming out of school, the only available work for them is to join up with the military. And I keep thinking about that busload of kids that Claire and I met. We were down at the bottom of the hill at what was then a Denny's, and it's right next door to the recruiting offices. And there were all these kids in identical T-shirts, and we just stopped and talked to them and said, why'd you sign up? And they said, it was military or homelessness, or continue living with my family. There was nothing else out there. And the government relies on massive unemployment to drive young people into the military, but that's only going to work so far. And when you're dealing with these millennials, now they're discovering that because of the sedentary lifestyle, the snowflakes, they're physically weak. They can't carry the amount of weight that soldiers during Vietnam were expected to carry. They can't throw the hand grenades far enough. The U.S. is saying, well, we had a caller in on the line saying, well, the next war is going to be fought with buttons. It's all going to be buttons and electronics. Well, think back to World War II. That was probably Hitler's biggest strategic mistake, was an over-reliance on the wonder weapons, which were very expensive, and they did work, but he couldn't afford to do too many of them, and in the long run, they proved to be ineffective, and the Nazis lost the war. And we're looking at the same situation here, plus the fact of Russia's dominance in electronic warfare. Now, it's one thing to send a drone into some third world country that can't possibly fight back and blow up a teacher in his class who just happened to be crossing the wrong street at the wrong time. But remember what the Russian electronic warfare aircraft did to the USS Donald Cook in the Black Sea. Absolutely shut it down. And again, we need to convince the government. I'm sure the American people are already saying we've had enough of war. We've got to find a way to convince this government, you're not going to win this one. And we're not going to stand, we're not going to throw ourselves in front of the enemy's bayonets anymore to protect you. If you want this war, you go fight it yourselves, the way Napoleon used to do, or Alexander the Great.
We haven't won a war since 1945.
Well, I'm sure the U.S. Well, actually, we haven't. We certainly didn't win in Korea. We certainly didn't win in Vietnam. We have these little covert police actions, regime changes. About half of those have been successful. Anyway, listen, Harry, got to let you go. Got a bunch of people waiting on the line here. And we're going to switch now over to Kathleen in Paris. Aloha, welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hi, Michael. Well, you're talking about, it's not what I called about, but you're talking about the military, so I have a question. Do you think if, I know there's this question about will the military be on the side of the people if there's something like a revolution?
I haven't actually conducted any kind of a survey, so I don't know. But the sense I get just from talking to people who are in the military, and we do have a lot of them around here, the officers will stand with the government. They're heavily invested with the government. They want to keep all that brass, and so they'll stay. Whether the rank and file will, that's problematic. There are a lot of just soldiers, Marines, and Navy people who know what this country is doing is wrong. People like Lieutenant Aaron Watada, who stood on principle regarding deployment to the war in Iraq. And we had his father on the show for an interview. They live not far from here. Of course, it's an island. Everything is not far from here. But it's going to be hard to say, but I think there'll probably be a sizable number of desertions from the rank and file military that just don't want to be forced to fire on Americans, on American people. And maybe that's one of the reasons they're flooding this country with all these refugees, is they're going to turn them into troops with which to try and put down an armed insurrection in this country. That I don't think will work either, because these refugees have no emotional connection to this country. They're not going to be an effective fighting force. The same thing with this idea that the Pentagon is going to entice all these illegal immigrants into uniform with the promise of citizenship after the war is over. Those illegal immigrants are not emotionally connected to this country. They will never be an effective fighting force compared to people who are defending their homes and loved ones that are within eyesight.
Every time I get a chance in the comments, I say to the military to refuse your orders.
Well,
anyway, what I was talking about.
After Nuremberg, they had that right. After Nuremberg, the Universal Code of Military Justice, soldiers, sailors, and air people, service people in general, do have a legal right to refuse any order that they think violates international law, which is exactly the point that Lieutenant Aaron Watada refused to go to Iraq on. And of course, the military tried to make an example of him, because the current attitude is to heck with war crimes, you do as you're told.
Well, anyway, I wanted to say that I always like it when you compare the current government to the mafia.
Yes.
But I wanted to point out one difference. Ties.
Well, the one difference I know is the mafia does have a code of honor.
Yeah, and but the government's bigger.
Yes, the government is bigger, so but again,
with no honor.
What if the organized crime and the government have become one and the same? I mean, look at all the drug running that's been going on. We know that at the time of John F. Kennedy, the CIA was starting to merge with the organized crime. They were using organized crime figures down in the war against Castro. Jack Ruby was both a mafia paymaster and a CIA asset. So what if mafia and government and CIA have all, over the decades, just merged to effectively be one and the same. That certainly would explain our foreign policy.
Point. That was my point, Michael.
Yeah.
That was my point. It's the size. If organized crime, there's no difference, really. I just thought it was funny to say that the difference between them is size. But in fact, they're probably just merged.
Yeah. Again, look at all the drug running, going all the way back to Arkansas in the 1980s. And it's always justified, we need the money because we're going to go stick our nose into Nicaragua where it doesn't belong. And therefore, we need to sell illegal drugs to America's kids in the name of the red, white, and blue. Okay?
Okay. Thanks, Michael.
All right. Thanks a lot. We're going to switch over to Alex. Good night. We're going to switch over to Alex in Florida. Aloha, Alex. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hey, Mike. I listened to Dick Morris the other night on YouTube. And he was talking about the dossier, and he was saying that Steele, who came up with the dossier that Trump colluded with Russians, that his advisor with that dossier was the same gentleman that made up the dossier that Iraq had nuclear weapons that could hit London in 45 minutes. You know that?
Well, I guess that's that guy's career, open an office that says lies are us.
Yeah, that was amazing to me. And these people still get to run around and do whatever they want to do, and it's sad and pathetic that I believe it now. When I see that, it's like I believe it, and that's where we've come to. And I also wanted to say I give Sean Hannity a lot of credit for reporting the news. However, Fox News was not going to allow him to report on Seth Rich. So that should tell us all something about Fox News as
yes.
well. That's sad. That kind of report, I would think that would be essential to us actually finding out who hacked the DNC server. Who murdered Seth Rich?
Well, we can find out who hacked the DNC server just by allowing it to be examined. But ever since Hillary and the Democrats started screaming, Russia hacked our server, they have refused every single request by any government agency to do a forensic analysis. And for all we know, by now, they've replaced all those hard drives and destroyed the originals.
Yeah. I have a question a little bit off of the topic, but as far as someone like you is concerned, what would be the disadvantages to you broadcasting or streaming on DTube as opposed to YouTube? Just out of curiosity.
Well, I'm going to be looking at that. Obviously, YouTube has deleted a lot of my videos, and so I cannot stay with them. And I've actually received an offer from CamZone to come on board with them, but I'm going to have to put that off until next week because this week and this weekend is jammed. We're still dealing with looking for the new car. Tonight is choir rehearsal night, and we're a little overscheduled. But yes, I am looking for a new replacement for the video adjunct to the program because YouTube has just shown itself to not be a supporter of the First Amendment. They are un-American. They are absolutist. They are communists, for all we know, because they're constantly attacking the conservatives and the right-wingers.
We all need to try to get off of YouTube. I know it's habit forming to go there, but I went to DTube the other night, and it seems it's simple to use. It's just like YouTube. Seems very simple. If we can go to platforms, any other platform other than YouTube, I think that would send a good message. If everyone said, I'm not going to watch it no matter what, it's not up on DTube or whatever, steam it, I'm not going to watch it. And I think that we have to hit these people in the pocketbook, and I think that would send a good signal to them. And the reason I ask you that question is because I was just wondering if it was more profitable to to upload your materials on YouTube as opposed to something like a D2.
Oh, YouTube,
maybe they don't
YouTube
have
has
the
never
market.
allowed me to monetize any of my videos, not even Claire's music videos. We're not allowed to monetize. They've never allowed us to monetize. Those are up there for free. And when I do find a new alternative video streaming, it may be Vimeo, it may be one of these others. We had a nice little list that we put up on the website yesterday. I am going to move all of the existing videos, Claire's music videos and everything, over to the new service, and then we'll cancel all of our YouTube accounts.
Yeah, and I recommend everybody do that. We need to get off of YouTube. And I also sent Trump an email basically letting him know that we, the people, need a platform, whether you agree with us or disagree with us. We all should have freedom of speech, and we should have a freedom of the press. And the independent media is the press, more so than the corporate media.
Well, I think over the centuries, if you will, the Supreme Court has consistently said that these guaranteed freedoms that we have in the First Amendment have to expand to keep up with the growth in technology. Now, obviously, when we're all coming together on corporate social media, it does represent our right to peacefully assemble and petition the government for redress of grievances. So when YouTube or Facebook or Twitter comes on in and deletes those petitions for the redress of grievances, they are in fact violating the First Amendment. And I'm glad so many lawyers are starting to file lawsuits because we cannot tolerate this behavior. We cannot tolerate a nation where the corporate media and the government are lying to us on a nonstop basis, and the available means of public communication available to the citizens have decided to act as gatekeepers and censors. We absolutely cannot allow that to happen.
That's right. We need to do something about it. Can I say one thing about gun rights?
Yes.
The book, War is a Racket, one of the main points that the gentleman made, the author of that book made, and I believe he was a Marine from Vietnam, I'm not sure. But
Major General Smedley Butler.
That's right. Anyway, one of the points he made in his book is the fact that this, where the United States is located globally, and because many of our citizens have guns, that it would be nearly impossible for any country to come in here and take us over. And I think that the Democrats know that, and that's why they want to get rid of our guns.
I think you're absolutely right. Alex, I got to let you go. We got to take a break for commercials. We have yet another caller waiting on the other side of these words from our sponsors. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here, and we're going to go right to the phones. Chuck in Texas. Aloha, Chuck. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind? Chuck, are you there? Hello, Chuck. I still can't hear you. Going once, going twice. Okay, well, we're going to go on back to the news. And here we are. Now, let me find this story here. I'm going to skip ahead because we're running out of time here. Now, as you know, YouTube did a second strike against the InfoWars channels, meaning one strike away from permanently being banned. And the public outcry was so huge, YouTube had to back down. And so all of a sudden, purely a coincidence, I am sure, Alex Jones has been accused of sexual harassment, bullying, anti-Semitism at InfoWars. And apparently somebody was able to find some ex-employees of InfoWars who were willing to go on out and say that Alex Jones made fun of one of the staffers, calling him the only Jew, which is not true, and that he made fun of somebody's race, that he was grabbing the rear end of a woman. Now, come on. Alex Jones and I have our differences, but I have to tell you, this stinks worse than ever. We know the corporate media have declared war on the independent media, and Alex Jones is a high-profile target. They want to take him out to throw the rest of us into fear. And they weren't able to get YouTube to do it, so now they've come up with this. We all know that all it takes it's easy to get people to tell lies to smear a target. All it takes is enough money. Remember that Trump accuser turned out to have been paid huge amounts of money. Huge amounts of money to smear him. And knowing Alex Jones' fanatical support for all things Israel, you cannot believe this claim that he's anti-Semitic all of a sudden. That is just absolutely absurd. Okay, now, it looks like we've got Chuck in Texas. We had a Bluetooth failure. Chuck, are you there?
I am.
Oh, good.
I had to laugh. I had to laugh whenever, and you beat me to the punch about Alex Jones being anti-Semitic. Well, I guess he wasn't pro-Israel enough. But anyway, that's not why I called in.
Okay.
I called in to mention we were talking about new platforms like YouTube, and on whatreallyhappened.com this morning, I happened to see where the health ranger, Mike Adams, is planning to start a new YouTube-type channel.
Yes.
And it was on your website that I saw that article.
Yeah, I'm eager to
so
see
we
what he's
all
going to
need
do with that. But given that YouTube is deleting my videos, I might have to go someplace else until Mike Adams gets that system up and running.
Well, I am looking forward. I mean, now there's a man I think has an awful lot of credibility, and I'm really that's when I'm going to jump on. I have to start my own YouTube channel back up again if he does that, because I won't bother right now. Just not worth the trouble. Anyway, Mike, great show as always.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. And we're going to let you go here. Have a good day. All right, let's see. All right. Let's get into this this weather situation, because it is nasty out there. I'm jumping around the talking points today because I'm way behind and I want to hit certain important things. Over in Ireland, they've been hit with Storm Emma, and they've literally gone into lockdown, what they call a status red. And they're telling everybody, you stay home. All schools, colleges, and third-level institutions are closed. And they're saying, don't go out on the road unless it's an emergency. So it is really nasty. I've seen some of the photos. It is just amazing over there. Story coming out of Mehra.com. Armed forces are deployed in England and Scotland. They're put on red alert. Britain's highest ever weather warning. For the first time, as the southwest faces up to 2 feet of snow, and the National Grid warns Great Britain is running out of gas. It is nasty. This is the beginning of the new little ice age. And they're saying this is definitely the worst weather they've had in a very, very long time. Apparently, over in Barcelona, Spain, they're trying to get ready for the start of the Formula One season, and the snow and ice there have shut down their track where they were going to start doing timing trials. They're into day 3 of preseason testing. They can't get a car out on the track because of the snow and ice. So it isn't just Ireland. It isn't just Britain and Scotland. We're getting huge amounts of bad weather warnings here in the U.S. We'll be right back after these commercials. And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show here. Now, getting into the world of computers and games, a lot of stuff going on, starting with political correctness run amok again. Apparently, social justice warriors have demanded game developer Vavra that he must include black people in a recently released game. The problem is the game is set in 1402 Bohemia. And so the game developer said, no, I'm not going to do that. That would not be historically accurate. And the social justice warriors just went ballistic. No, you must have black people. You must have this. You must have that. We're going to go down the quota list. And now they're out there to basically destroy the game and the company. And that's one of the real problems with the social justice warrior movement. Their utter disregard for historical or scientific accuracy. It's all politicized. Boy, I feel sorry for anybody in Hollywood just trying to remake Moby Dick. No women. The colored actors are all in subordinate roles, and it shows cruelty to animals. Now then, actually, that's not accurate. There was that wonderful movie they did about the true story behind Moby Dick, the Essex. That was a good movie. Anyway, YouTube is now claiming that all of these conservative channels that have been taken down, it was done so mistakenly. And they're actually blaming the fact that they've had to hire a lot of new people to be the guardians of your tender little sensitivities, and that some of them misapply the rules and the definitions. But despite the apology, they have not reinstated the videos. They're just trying to stop the public relations damage. Now, over at 12160, they received a YouTube strike today based on a video about Sandy Hook posted 5 years ago. It is a purge, is what is going on here. It's like the old Nazi book burning in the computer age. That's exactly what YouTube is doing. They're burning the books that don't agree with dogma. YouTube, Uber, alles, sig heil. Apparently, according to this article over an Investment Watch blog, not only are YouTube channels getting taken down, their content creators are being blocked from even watching any other videos on YouTube at all. Your permissions are your account is effectively useless. Now, Tucker Carlson went on the warpath on this and reminded us all that YouTube's trusted content flaggers include a wholly discredited hate group. And of course, we're talking about the Southern Poverty Law Center, which doesn't help the poor and doesn't really seem to understand the law. But they're always the first ones to be out there saying that this is hate and that's hate and you've got to not talk to these people and these are anti-Semites. And I'm rather proud to say that whatreallyhappened.com was on one of their lists of websites you should never, ever, ever, ever look at or your nose will fall off. So it means I'm having some kind of a positive effect. Now, Facebook recently changed their algorithm, apparently under a year of pressure from the left. And as a result, Trump's Facebook engagement declined by 45%. They're literally gaming the systems against conservatives. They're cheating, is what the liberals are doing. They're cheating. Now, again, we are seeing lawyers, free speech lawyers, are starting to file lawsuits. And apparently, James Damore has a lawsuit out there, and they're basically saying they're calling for government regulation of Google, Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter to halt these tech giants' censorship, say that 3 times fast, shadow banning, and blacklisting of independent media content. Well, it sounds good. Who do you think is telling Google, Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter to shadow ban and censor and blacklist? This is coming down from the government. It is a clear violation of our First Amendment rights. But we reach the point where the government is scared. And their attitude seems to be that self-defense justifies ignoring the Bill of Rights. It doesn't. They are. Apparently, in April of 2017, the Israeli police arrested this dual U.S.-Israeli citizen, Michael Ron David Kadar. And apparently, this guy was making all these fake anti-Semitic hate crimes. And he used voice-changing technology, was able to mask his IP, and he made thousands of hoax calls worldwide, including against airlines and police stations. And he's been charged with money laundering and the attempted blackmail of Ernesto Lopez, a Republican Delaware state senator. But the idea is that this guy personally was responsible for hundreds and hundreds of incidents that were being reported as anti-Semitic hate crimes. And they weren't. They were all hoaxes. Now, out in California, something very interesting is going on with the Democrats. First of all, they refuse to endorse Dianne Feinstein for this November's elections. That came as a shock to everybody. And here's another shocker, because apparently Democrats approved a position on pending legislation that includes opposition to the Israel Anti-Boycott Act. In other words, the Democratic Party in California is opposed to bills that penalize boycotts of Israel. They're apparently actually understanding that boycotts are a recognized form of protest protected by the First Amendment. And that is really a very good thing. Now, as you know, earlier today, the Dow Jones Industrial Average plunged. It almost hit 600 down. And Wall Street is blaming Donald Trump's talk about aluminum and steel tariffs. But he was talking about those yesterday, and we didn't see that much happen on the market. So again, I think the real issues are much more complex. And I think we are basically seeing the run-up to what is going to be a major panic on Wall Street. Story out of Investment Watch blog. Basically, Jerome Powell came out pretty hawkish in his debut, and he's the new Federal Reserve Chairman, and he says he sees little risk of recession. And he's reaffirmed his plans to continue tightening the money supply through interest rate increases and quantitative tightening. But there are signs that Powell's optimism is unwarranted. And this monetary blanket knitted together with nearly a decade of easy money could very easily unravel. And that's a very good reason. If you have any kind of a variable rate credit card, variable rate car loan, variable rate credit card, get them paid off now or get them converted to fixed rate. Because when the Fed raises the rate, all those variable rates go up as well. We saw that in 2008. That's what wiped out so many American families. And the fact is that the soaring Dow is predicated on that easy, cheap money to buy stocks. And so I think today's drop, rather than blaming it on Trump's steel and aluminum tariffs, could just as easily be explained by the Wall Street reaction to the new chairman of the Federal Reserve saying, we're going to start raising rates on all this money we've been loaning you. Because every time they use this cheap money to prop up the market and the money stops being cheap, there is a correction. Now, over in the European Union, Draghi is admitting they can't stop buying government debt. They're having to prop up their member states. This is what happens when you try and run a national economy on a debt-based private central bank, where private bankers are allowed to just create the money out of thin air, no commodity base, and they loan it into circulation at interest. And this system is great for the bankers because it builds debt and builds debt on which interest is paid, and that's what makes the bankers so rich and powerful. This concept of a private central bank has made its owners the richest people on earth. They're so rich, you never get to hear about them. They don't want you to know they're there. They don't want you to know how much they've made off of you. That's why they're fighting Ron Paul's full audit of the Federal Reserve tooth and nail, even to the point of threatening to bring down the economy. They don't want you to know what's happened to it. Now, here in the United States, total student loan debt now exceeds the cost of the entire Iraq war. And right now, the average is a 22-year-old graduating from university has an average of $50,000 in student debt. The total amount of student debt in the United States, according to the Federal Reserve, is $1.5 trillion with a T. And what do those students get with all that money? Ooh, whiteness is bad. Gender is fluid, and humans are causing global warming. Out in the Los Angeles Times, they have an article that is asking a very cogent question. How can a place with 58,000 homeless people continue to function? And it's almost impossible to imagine that many people on the streets of Los Angeles. It's hard to imagine, where's the food coming to keep these people alive? Where are they finding places to go poo? It is a huge strain. Remember when everybody said war is good for the economy? And we've been at war now for 18 years. Look at the economy for everybody except the warmongers. They're doing great. They're doing fabulous. The rest of us Americans, 58,000 homeless people in Los Angeles, 8,000 homeless on this island. Does that look like it's a working economy? I don't think so. Now, legendary trader Paul Tudor Jones is arguing that the Federal Reserve is about to lose control and that inflation is set to accelerate sharply, making bonds a very poor investment. And that the Federal Reserve must act swiftly to tackle financial bubbles created by prolonged monetary easing, and that is an issue. There are so many bubbles out there. Even Ron Paul is out there saying the Federal Reserve is at a crossroads. There is a crisis coming. The Federal Reserve has created a mountain of problems for everyone in the United States, and every single solution that they come up with leads to more problems. Everything they do, it always creates more debt. They won't write off the debt. That would solve everything. But if we're ever going to be free, we have to stop being slaves to private central bankers. And you need to understand, bankers can and often are crooks. We've been reporting on all the fraud coming out of places like Deutsche Bank, Wells Fargo, and remember, this was back in 2012. CNBC actually gave corporate media attention to the largest money laundering and racketeering lawsuit in U.S. history, in which banksters and their U.S. racketeering partners were accused of laundering $43 trillion, with a T, dollars worth of ill-gotten gains. And then the very next date, the children of the executive at CNBC were murdered under suspicious circumstances, and CNBC dropped the story. Now, the corporate media said the children's nanny was responsible for the murders, allegedly just stabbing both children for absolutely no reason that anybody could figure out. And then, of course, they said she slit her own throat right after the homicides were committed. Couldn't possibly be another person there. Couldn't possibly be a hit against this CNBC executive who was about to wreck $43 trillion worth of laundered money for the bankers. Now, Iran has gone ahead and banned the use of the U.S. dollar in trade. This is appears to be a preemptive move against further U.S. sanctions. They're not going to do any business with the dollar, and as long as they're not, the U.S. can't touch them. And they're basically saying that any purchase orders that are denominated in U.S. dollars are no longer allowed to go through import procedures. And they're saying the policy is in line with the official request by the Central Bank of Iran and is meant to address fluctuations in market rates of the U.S. dollar, which has been bouncing around quite a bit. It's very volatile. And I think probably a lot of people are saying the dollar could very well drop. Okay. Pakistan has announced a new 1,500-mile-long border fence is going to be built. Israel, of course, has their wall along the West Bank and Gaza. Europe is starting to build walls. The only country that's not allowed to have a border wall is the United States. And the liberals are still out there screaming and crying, oh, the wall is racist. No, it isn't. Illegal is not a race. And this idea, just cut the grass so they can't sneak through. They're trying everything they can to keep that flow of illegal immigrants coming to this country, no matter how much harm it causes our infrastructure, no matter how much harm it causes the people, no matter how much harm it causes the economy, because those Democrats have admitted they need those illegal immigrants to vote to hang on to power, even though illegal immigrants by law are not allowed to vote. They're cheating out in the open. They're gaming the system, and they don't care if you're seeing it or not. Now, experts are predicting that Muslims are going to outbreed Europeans and take over the continent, and the Libyan Coast Guard is saying about another 1 million Muslim migrants are headed to Europe right now. Now, here, again, this idea that all of a sudden it is now considered acceptable to target and discriminate against white people. Apparently, a group of students at the University of Texas, San Antonio, plans to start publishing a magazine called No Whites Allowed. Now, can you imagine the reaction if the magazine had been called No Blacks Allowed? Racism is wrong no matter what direction it goes. But the publishers of the magazine are saying, this is all justified because of slavery and segregation. We didn't take part in any of that. It's just like Israel. You're relying on some injustice that happened in the long ago historical past to justify bad behavior today. We'll be right back after these few words. Aloha America, welcome back to our show. Last segment of the program today. We're going to take one more phone call, and that is from Francis in North Carolina. Aloha, Francis. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hello, aloha to you both. Nice and everything. And thanks for indulging me for that matter. But when you said about why they won't wipe away the national debt, that's when it hit me like a brick bat as to why they would never do it. Because, one, they need the national debt to propagate the IRS filing of taxes and all that on the everyday person as a necessary, well, you have to do this in order to keep our government going and all that garbage. They don't really need that. They don't. It's a joke. So in order to keep that propagated, they have to have the national debt there to make people feel guilty that they have to go and pay into it. Have a great one.
All right, thanks an awful lot here, and I would say that basically the whole purpose of taxation is not necessarily to raise revenue, but to control behavior. And certainly in many cases you will see the tax laws are written to favor and encourage certain things and to discourage other things, luxury tax and so forth and so on. The tax on machine guns, for example. Okay, I'm watching the TV news here, and they're still on this whole thing about gun control, and Congress is under huge pressure for gun control. If you are a supporter of the First Amendment, your assignment is to get on the telephone. Forget email, forget regular postal mail. Get on the telephone to the offices of your representative and your 2 state senators and express your position on the First Amendment. That banning all guns because what a few crazies do with them makes about as much sense as banning all cars because there are some drunk drivers who kill people. And just say, we stand on our First Amendment rights. Now, earlier in the week, I talked to you about this documentary called Atomic Homefront. It's still on HBO. In fact, I got a chance to watch it again last night. It's a very haunting documentary. It's well made. And you start to realize how often this happens, where corporations just dump this toxic stuff and they don't care what happens to future generations. And government very often looks the other way. And the latest one apparently has to do with the company in Michigan that makes Wolverine Worldwide. And they ran a tannery, and they had these special chemicals used to waterproof their boots and shoes. This is in Rockford, Michigan. The chemicals are called perfluoroalkyl sulfonate, PFAS, and they're starting to look into this. This stuff was dumped in the 60s and 70s. It went into the groundwater and drinking wells, and people have been exposed to this stuff. And they have it sky high, 750 times the average normal acceptable exposure for PFAS. And again, cancer rates are right through the roof. And apparently investigators have found there were 75 different sites around that part of the state where Worldwide Wolverine was dumping these hazardous chemicals. All right, there's the music. Time for me to get on out of here and get something useful done with the rest of the day. Please stay tuned for John Stedmiller. I'm sure he's got a lot of interesting things to share with you. And please, again, call your members of Congress on the First Amendment issue. They're really trying to do this final push to disarm us so that we will do what we're told to do. That's the purpose of disarmament, to take away our freedom and our right to say no. There is no freedom without the freedom to say no. We'll be back tomorrow. Aloha, America.